In the ruins of a world shattered by the Second World War, two superpowers stood facing each other across the smoking debris of Europe. On one side, the United States, flush with victory, wealth, and nuclear firepower. On the other, the Soviet Union, bloodied but unbroken, marching out of the ashes of 27 million dead, armed with ideology and iron resolve. Between them stretched a broken continent of ruins, hunger, and fear. For centuries, Europe had been the center of global power. Now, in the wake of Hitler's downfall, Europe became the battleground where the future of the entire world would be decided. This was the beginning of the Cold War. And from the ashes of the last Great War arose a new alliance, one that would reshape the destiny of nations. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. The story of NATO is not simply the story of military treaties and politics. It is the story of survival in an age of terror, of alliances forged in fear, and of civilizations testing the very limits of human existence under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. It is the story of America standing guard over the West, of the Soviet Union building an empire behind the Iron Curtain, and of the countless nations caught in between, sometimes fighting, sometimes falling, sometimes finding their own voice in a world divided into two camps. To understand why NATO was created, one must return to the chaos of 1945. The war had ended, but peace was fragile. Europe's cities were bombed out shells, its people homeless and hungry. Factories had collapsed into rubble. Fields lay scorched and barren. In this void, communism promised food, order, and equality, ideas that found fertile ground among the desperate. The Soviet Union, already occupying much of Eastern Europe, moved swiftly to install friendly governments in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and beyond. Behind Stalin's watchful eye, a new empire was being born. Meanwhile, the United States took a different approach. Determined not to repeat the mistakes of isolationism after World War I, America poured money into Europe through the Marshall Plan, a lifeline of aid that rebuilt industries, fed the starving, and restored hope. But this generosity came with strings. Nations who accepted Marshall Plan aid had to align with the West, not the Soviet bloc. The clash was inevitable. In 1948, Stalin tested the West with the Berlin Blockade, cutting off all road and rail access to the western sectors of Berlin. The city starved, and Stalin believed the West would give up. But instead, American and British planes filled the skies, landing every few minutes, day and night, in the greatest airlift in history. For nearly a year, food, coal, and medicine rained down from the skies, and Stalin was forced to back down. Berlin had been saved, and the West had proven it would not abandon its allies. Out of this crisis, NATO was born. In 1949, 12 nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty, pledging that an attack on one would be an attack on all. For the first time in its history, the United States committed itself to a permanent alliance in Europe. The message was clear: the West would not stand alone, and any Soviet move against one nation would bring the full force of America to bear. But Stalin was not finished. The Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb in 1949, shattering America's monopoly on nuclear weapons. The world had entered a new era, an era where survival itself depended on balance, deterrence, and the terrifying doctrine of mutually assured destruction. The early years of the Cold War became a chessboard of fear and strategy. In Asia, the Korean War erupted in 1950, pitting communist North Korea and its Chinese allies against South Korea and a U.S.-led United Nations force. For the first time, NATO's promise was tested beyond Europe. American troops fought and died to halt the spread of communism, and though the war ended in stalemate, the message was unmistakable. The Cold War would not be confined to Europe's ruins. It would stretch across the globe. Meanwhile, spies and propaganda waged invisible wars in every corner of life. School children in America practiced hiding under desks from nuclear blasts, while in the Soviet Union, generations were taught that capitalism was a dying system, and that history itself was on the side of socialism. Radios, newspapers, and films became weapons. Every victory in sport, every triumph in science, was cast as proof that one system was superior. The world was split in two, and the cracks grew deeper. The 1960s opened with tension rising across every front. NATO stood watching Europe, its armies massed against the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet military alliance created in direct response to NATO. But the real battle for the world's future was now being fought in the minds of people far beyond Europe. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, newly independent nations emerged from colonialism and faced a choice: to side with the capitalist West or the communist East. Each superpower courted them with promises, aid, and threats. The stakes grew even higher in October 1962, when the world stood closer to nuclear war than ever before. Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev secretly deployed nuclear missiles to Cuba, just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. When American reconnaissance planes discovered the missile sites, President John F. Kennedy faced a decision that could end civilization. For 13 days, the world held its breath as U.S. naval ships blockaded Cuba, Soviet vessels approached the line, and both sides prepared for war. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the ultimate test of will. American generals urged Kennedy to bomb the missile sites and invade Cuba. But Kennedy, aware of the unimaginable consequences, chose a blockade instead. Forcing the Soviets withdrew their missiles, and the United States secretly agreed to remove its own from Turkey. The crisis ended without a shot fired, but it left an indelible scar on the world's psyche. Never before had humanity come so close to annihilation. The Cold War was no longer an abstract contest of ideas. It was survival itself, balanced on a knife's edge. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, the Cold War spilled blood in the jungles of Vietnam. Determined to stop the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, the United States committed hundreds of thousands of troops to defend South Vietnam against the Communist North, backed by Moscow and Beijing. For years, American soldiers waded through rice paddies, fought in dense forests, and endured a war with no clear front lines. Helicopters filled the skies, villages were burned, and millions of Vietnamese civilians were caught in the crossfire. The war deeply divided America. At home, television screens brought the horrors of combat into living rooms every night. Protesters filled the streets, questioning why so much blood was being spilled for a conflict halfway across the globe. The Vietnam War became a wound in the American spirit, one that made the public question the limits of U.S. power. But while Vietnam was a tragedy for the United States, it was also proof of how the Cold War had become a truly global struggle. From the Middle East to Latin America, superpowers backed coups, revolutions, and proxy wars. In Africa, the Congo crisis, the Angolan Civil War, and the battle for influence across the continent turned nations into pawns in the great game between East and West. In Latin America, the U.S. supported military dictatorships and covert operations to stop communist movements, most famously in Chile, where President Salvador Allende was overthrown in 1973. Everywhere, the Cold War was a shadow war. Tanks rarely rolled across European borders, but in distant lands, the weapons of NATO and the Warsaw Pact clashed through the hands of others. Yet even in this age of confrontation, there were moments of cautious peace. In the early 1970s, a period known as détente brought a thaw in relations between the superpowers. Treaties like SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, placed the first real restrictions on nuclear arsenals. American President Richard Nixon even traveled to Moscow and Beijing, opening doors that had long been sealed shut. For a moment, it seemed possible that the world might step back from the brink. But peace was fleeting. The arms race never truly stopped. Each side poured money into building more powerful weapons, developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarines armed with nuclear warheads, and fleets of bombers ready to strike at a moment's notice. NATO developed a strategy of flexible response, ensuring that any Soviet move could be countered at every level, from conventional warfare to total nuclear retaliation. The doctrine was clear: deterrence through overwhelming strength. In the Soviet Union, life was different but no less defined by the Cold War. Citizens lived under the constant presence of propaganda, reminding them that NATO was a threat to their very survival. Soviet schools taught children to fear Western aggression, to believe that America wanted to destroy their system and enslave their people. Yet beneath the surface, the Soviet system was beginning to strain. The economy groaned under the weight of military spending. Basic goods were often scarce. And while the government projected an image of unity and strength, cracks were already forming in the empire. By the late 1970s, those cracks began to widen. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was meant to preserve a communist government friendly to Moscow. Instead, it became their Vietnam, a decade-long conflict that drained resources, cost countless lives, and revealed the limits of Soviet power. The United States, through covert programs, armed Afghan fighters with modern weapons, turning the rugged mountains into a graveyard for Soviet ambitions. Once again, the Cold War had claimed another battlefield, and once again, ordinary people paid the price. The 1980s marked both the most dangerous and the most decisive decade of the Cold War. After the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, tensions reached a fever pitch. In Washington, President Ronald Reagan abandoned the language of détente and declared the Soviet Union an evil empire. Under his leadership, America poured billions into rebuilding its military might. New missiles, stealth bombers, and a proposed missile defense system known as Star Wars promised to tilt the balance of power in NATO's favor. For the Soviets, this was a nightmare. Their economy was already faltering, yet they felt compelled to match NATO weapon for weapon. The Kremlin pushed its factories to produce tanks, missiles, and nuclear warheads, even as store shelves went empty and ordinary citizens waited in long lines for bread. The Cold War had become an arms race of unsustainable proportions. But Reagan's strategy was not just about weapons. It was about pressure. NATO deployed Pershing II and cruise missiles in Europe, placing nuclear firepower just minutes from Moscow. Massive military exercises like Able Archer terrified the Soviet leadership, who feared that NATO might disguise a real attack as a drill. More than once, the world stood on the edge of catastrophe as misunderstandings and false alarms at the height of hostility, cracks of hope began to appear. In 1985, a new leader rose to power in the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev. Unlike his predecessors, Gorbachev understood that the Soviet system was on the verge of collapse. He introduced policies of glasnost, or openness, and perestroika, or restructuring. These reforms loosened censorship, encouraged limited political freedom, and attempted to modernize the struggling economy. Gorbachev also sought peace abroad. He met with Reagan in a series of historic summits, where both leaders agreed to reduce nuclear arsenals and ease tensions. In 1987, they signed the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons. For the first time, the superpowers were not just limiting their arms race, they were rolling it back. Still, the forces unleashed by reform could not be contained. Across Eastern Europe, people began to demand freedom. In Poland, the Solidarity movement gained strength. In Hungary, the Iron Curtain began to crumble. And in East Germany, the wall that had divided Berlin for decades became the target of protest and defiance. On the night of November 9, 1989, the unthinkable happened. Crowds of East Germans surged to the Berlin Wall, demanding to cross into the West. Overwhelmed, border guards opened the gates. Families embraced, strangers danced atop the wall, and hammers rang out as people began tearing down the most hated symbol of the Cold War. The fall of the Berlin Wall was more than the collapse of a barrier. It was the collapse of an empire. One by one, communist governments in Eastern Europe fell, until only the Soviet Union remained. By 1991, even that giant could no longer stand. On Christmas Day, the Soviet flag was lowered for the last time above the Kremlin. The Cold War was over. NATO had endured, while its greatest rival dissolved into history. But victory brought new challenges. What was NATO's purpose without the Soviet threat? Some argued it should fade away. Instead, NATO expanded, welcoming former Warsaw Pact nations into its ranks. For countries like Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic, joining NATO meant security against any future aggression from the East. The 1990s brought hope of a new world order, one led not by confrontation, but by cooperation. Yet NATO soon found itself fighting again, not against Russia, but in the Balkans, where ethnic conflict and genocide tore Yugoslavia apart. In Bosnia and later in Kosovo, NATO launched air campaigns to halt the bloodshed, proving it could act even outside its traditional European defense role. Then came the defining moment of the 21st century, September 11, 2001. For the first time in history, NATO invoked Article 5, the principle that an attack on one is an attack on all. NATO troops joined the United States in Afghanistan, waging war against the Taliban and al-Qaeda. For years, NATO soldiers patrolled villages, trained local forces, and fought in rugged mountains. Another long, grueling war stretched on. NATO faced new tests. The 2003 U.S. invasion of Iraq split allies. The rise of cyber warfare, terrorism, and global instability forced NATO to adapt to challenges far different from the Cold War era. And yet, the shadow of history never disappeared. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, shocking the world and reminding Europe that old threats were not gone. NATO once again shifted its focus eastward, deploying troops to deter further aggression. In 2022, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine reignited fears of confrontation between Moscow and the West. Once more, NATO found itself at the center of history, supplying weapons, intelligence, and support to Ukraine while avoiding direct war with Russia. Through every chapter, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to the Berlin Wall, from the deserts of Afghanistan to the battlefields of Ukraine, NATO has stood as a symbol of collective defense, for better or worse. Critics argue it has overstepped, drawn into conflicts far beyond its original purpose. Supporters counter that it has preserved peace in Europe for more than 70 years, a feat unmatched in modern history. Today, NATO faces its greatest question since the end of the Cold War. Can it continue to hold together in a world no longer defined by two superpowers, but by many rising forces, new technologies, and unpredictable dangers? The story of NATO is not just about armies and treaties. It is about survival, unity, and the determination of nations to stand together against fear. From the ruins of World War II to the uncertainty of the 21st century, NATO's journey has been one of resilience. And as history has shown, the alliance is not merely a relic of the past, but a force still shaping the future.